In the summer of 1900, at a costume ball on the coast of Brittany, a 21-year-old girl from Cincinnati fell in love with a duke. She was Helena Zimmerman, the only child of Eugene Zimmerman, one of the most successful railroad investors in Ohio, a man who had built his fortune from nothing, from a burned factory and a Union Navy enlistment and a Standard Oil stake and a railroad presidency, and who had sent his motherless daughter to France to be educated, because France was where the daughters of American millionaires were finished. She was blonde and accomplished, skilled at horse riding and fencing, described by the Cincinnati Enquirer as a handsome belle and an expert swimmer. She had grown up without her mother, who had died of peritonitis when Helena was 4 years old, and she had grown up in the conditions of a wealthy girl without a woman to guide her, in the care of a father who loved her and who was constitutionally better equipped to build railroads than to prepare his daughter for the dangers of the world she was about to enter. He was William Angus Drogo Montagu, the 9th Duke of Manchester. His friends called him Kim. He was 23 years old, which was old enough to have accumulated gambling debts that would have disgraced a man twice his age, to have been publicly linked to 22 women he was supposedly engaged to have been described in the press as one of the most notorious fortune hunters in England, and to have been declared bankrupt with a family title that required an American heiress to survive. He was also the son of Consuelo Yznaga. That detail is the one the story cannot avoid. The Manchester dukedom had already consumed one American fortune in the generation before Helena arrived. Kim's mother, the Cuban-American heiress from Louisiana, who had married his father, the 8th Duke, in 1876, had paid for the title with her dowry and had watched the dowry vanish into gambling debts, and her daughters die of tuberculosis and her husband spend himself into the grave. The family, into which Helena Zimmerman was dancing at the Brittany costume ball, had already demonstrated, in the generation just ended, exactly what it did to American women who arrived carrying money. Helena danced anyway. Now here is the question this video is going to answer. Eugene Zimmerman was not a fool. He had built his fortune from nothing, and he had structured his will specifically to prevent the Duke of Manchester from touching his daughter's inheritance. Helena would receive the income, but the principal would remain in trust, beyond the reach of the man who had already gone through most of it and who was still trying. He had taken every precaution a father could take within the laws of two countries and the conventions of an era that still treated a woman's marriage as a transaction between her father and her husband. The question is, why it did not work, why the precautions were not enough. Why Helena Zimmerman, who was intelligent and accomplished, and the beloved only child of a man who had seen Kim coming from across the Atlantic and had done everything in his power to protect her, ended up spending 30 years married to a man who was found in bed with 4 women, including a famous actress at the family estate, who pawned the family jewels he was legally prohibited from pawning, who fled to Cuba in 1931 to obtain a divorce before his wife could, and who spent every year of the marriage creating new forms of damage that the law and Helena's father had not anticipated. The question is, what it costs when the precautions are not enough. Drop your city in the comments, and if these stories matter to you, the ones about the women the Gilded Age used as currency, subscribe. Now let us go back to Cincinnati in 1878, to the family that produced Helena Zimmerman, and let us find out what she was brought into and what it took from her. Eugene Zimmerman was born in Vicksburg, Mississippi in 1845, the son of a factory owner. He was 13 when his father died. He was 17 when the Civil War began and the factory his father had left him burned to the ground in the conflict that destroyed the Mississippi economy and the way of life on which it depended. He enlisted in the Union Navy, a Mississippi boy fighting for the Union, which was not the common choice of the sons of Vicksburg, but which was the choice he made, and served with what the records describe as distinction, which was the word used for young men who did what was asked of them without flinching. After the war, he went north. He attended Kenyon College in Ohio. He went into the oil business in the years when the Pennsylvania oil fields were producing the fortunes that Standard Oil would eventually consolidate. He acquired holdings. He sold them to John D. Rockefeller in exchange for Standard Oil shares, which was the transaction that converted his oil profits into something more durable. He became a substantial Standard Oil stockholder and took a seat on the board. Then he invested in railroads. The railroad investments were what built the fortune to its full expression. He became president of several railroad companies, the Cincinnati Gas and Utilities Networks, the transportation infrastructure of a Midwestern city in its industrial peak. By the 1890s, Eugene Zimmerman was one of the richest men in Cincinnati, which meant one of the richest men in Ohio, which meant one of the richest men in the United States. He did all of this after his wife died. Marietta Evans Zimmerman died in 1882 when Helena was 4 years old. Peritonitis, a swift and brutal death for a young woman in an era when abdominal surgery was not yet reliable. Eugene was left with a daughter, a growing fortune, and no partner with whom to raise either. He raised Helena himself with whatever assistance the households of wealthy widowed men provided, and he sent her to France when she was old enough to be sent somewhere, because France was where American heiresses were made, where they acquired the languages and the graces and the social skills that the Gilded Age required of women who were going to be presented as matches for the European aristocracy. He gave her the education that the era prescribed for daughters of his class, and he loved her in the somewhat helpless way of men who are excellent at building things and less excellent at the daily work of raising a child without a co-parent. When Helena came back from France in 1900, she was 21 years old, and she was going to be easy to impress. The Standard Oil connection is the fact about Eugene Zimmerman that most precisely places Helena's fortune in its historical moment. Standard Oil in 1882, the year of Marietta's death and Helena's motherless childhood, was the most powerful corporation in the United States, possibly in the world. Rockefeller had assembled, through a combination of horizontal integration and the specific ruthlessness of a man who understood that controlling the distribution of oil was more valuable than controlling its production, a monopoly over the refining and transportation of American petroleum that no competitor could match, and no regulator had yet found the tools to break. The men who had sold their oil holdings to Standard Oil in exchange for shares had made, in most cases, the best financial decision available to them. The shares appreciated with the expansion of the enterprise, and the dividends were paid from revenues that no competitive pressure could threaten. Eugene Zimmerman was one of those men. He had built his oil position in the years before Rockefeller's consolidation, and had sold at the right moment, and had taken the Standard Oil shares and had not sold them. He had then invested in railroads, not the grand transcontinental railroads that were consuming the fortunes of the Vanderbilt and Morgan generation, but the regional Midwestern railroads that served the growing industrial cities of Ohio and Indiana and Michigan, the networks that moved coal and steel and manufactured goods between the cities that were building the industrial economy of the American Midwest. He was good at this. He understood transportation infrastructure the way Hetty Green had understood bonds. From the inside, with the specific knowledge of a man who had spent decades learning what made the difference between a railroad that paid and a railroad that did not. He became president of several companies. He accumulated directorships. He sat on the Standard Oil Board. He was, by the 1890s, the kind of man whose presence at a meeting in Cincinnati meant that decisions of consequence were being made. He was also a widower who was raising a daughter alone. The two facts coexisted in the way of wealthy men in the Gilded Age who were excellent at their work and who had organized their lives around that work in the absence of the partner who would have organized the non-work parts. Helena was sent to France because sending her to France was the decision that his world made in those circumstances, a decision made for her rather than with her, in the way of fathers who love their children and who do not quite know what to do with daughters. She came back from France in 1900, accomplished and educated and 21 years old, and she went to Dinard and she met a duke at a costume ball, and 4 months later she was married without her father's knowledge, and Kim was already talking about ways to access the fortune. Eugene Zimmerman had built his fortune from nothing, from a burned factory and a war and 30 years of Ohio commerce, and he had tried with everything available to him to protect his daughter from the man she had married. He protected her income. He did not protect her. The 9th Duke of Manchester had been working on Helena Zimmerman's impression since the summer of 1900 in Dinard. He was good at impressions. The skills the English aristocracy developed in its young men, the ease, the charm, the manner of someone born to confidence, the ability to make a woman feel she was the most interesting person in any room, were skills that Kim Montagu possessed in the concentrated form of someone who had needed them all his adult life. His father's gambling had left the family nearly destitute. His own gambling had added a fresh layer of debt that the family title alone could no longer service. He needed money. He had always needed money. The looking for money had given him a great deal of practice at the preliminary work of seeming not to need it. He had been publicly linked to 22 women before he met Helena. A newspaper published a photograph of him surrounded by portraits of these 22 supposed fiancées after his wedding, a summary of the deliberate ambiguity that was his method, allowing each woman to believe the engagement was more serious than it was, keeping the options open, never committing to anyone until someone came along with the right amount of money and the right degree of vulnerability. Helena came along. She was the only child of one of the richest men in Ohio. She had grown up without a mother, which meant without the education and the dangers of charming men that mothers provide. She had been sent to France to acquire the qualities that made American girls attractive to European aristocrats, which means she had been educated specifically for the transaction into which she was now entering. She was intelligent and accomplished in 21, and she was at a costume ball on the French coast with a duke who was telling her she was the most interesting woman he had ever met. She fell in love, or what she took for love. The accounts of people who observed them in those months describe a young woman who was genuinely smitten, who believed, as young women in costume balls on the French coast sometimes believe, that the attraction was mutual and real, and that the dukedom and the debts were incidental features of a man whose primary quality was that he loved her. His primary quality was that he needed her money. Whether he also loved her, in whatever attenuated form love is available to men who have spent their 20s systematically targeting wealthy women, is a question the historical record does not cleanly answer. What the record shows is that he moved quickly. The meeting was in the summer. The marriage was in November. 4 months from costume ball to Marylebone Church, which was fast enough to prevent the necessary conversations and the due diligence and the interrogation of character that might have produced information Helena needed. The 22 women in the newspaper photograph are worth examining because they are the clearest evidence of Kim Montagu's method before Helena arrived. The photograph was published in a British newspaper in November 1900, immediately after the wedding. A photograph of the new Duke of Manchester surrounded by portraits of the 22 women he had supposedly been engaged to or was rumored to have been pursuing for marriage. The number 22 was not an accusation of romantic enthusiasm. It was an accusation of deliberate strategy. The method was this: identify wealthy women, cultivate an acquaintance that suggested the possibility of engagement without formally proposing, allow the ambiguity to develop to the point where the woman believed the engagement was more serious than it was, then move on when something more advantageous appeared or when the specific woman's financial situation was less attractive than initially assessed. Repeat until the right combination of wealth and vulnerability and social isolation presented itself. 22 women. Some were American heiresses on the European circuit, as Helena was. Some were English women of property. Some were actresses and entertainers, which suggested that the pursuit was not always purely financial, and that Kim Montagu's appetites were various. One was Pauline Astor, whose family wealth was substantial enough to have resolved the financial difficulties permanently if the match had been made. One was May Golay, described by contemporaries as one of America's richest heiresses. One was Joan Wilson, daughter of a member of Parliament. None of them had married him. Whether this was because they had detected the character beneath the charm, or because their families had intervened, or because he had moved on before the commitment solidified, the record does not fully explain. What it shows is that by the time Helena met him at the Dinard costume ball in the summer of 1900, the 9th Duke of Manchester was 23 years old and had been systematically targeting wealthy women for at least 3 years. He had proposed, or something close enough to proposal to produce public speculation, to at least 22 of them. Helena was 21. She had never been proposed to before. She did not know about the 22. Her father was not with her in Dinard. He had returned to America, leaving her with a chaperone who, by the accounts of what followed, was not equal to the specific challenge of protecting a wealthy American girl from a motivated English duke. The chaperone, the historical record notes with some delicacy, was easily won over. 4 months later, Helena and Kim were married at Marylebone Church with no family present and no consent obtained, and the 23-year-old Duke, who had been linked to 22 women, was now married to number 23, who happened to have the father with the most money. The wedding on November 14, 1900, at Marylebone Church in London had no guests from either family. Neither Helena's father nor the Duke's mother were present. Neither had consented. Eugene Zimmerman learned of his daughter's marriage via a newspaper and a cablegram from Helena herself. The cablegram arriving after the fact, sent by a daughter who knew that the news would be easier to receive from a newspaper than from her father's face. The Duke's mother was Consuelo Yznaga, the woman who had paid $1 million for the Manchester title in 1876, who had watched her twin daughters die of tuberculosis in the damp Irish castle, to which her husband's father had exiled her, who had spent 20 years managing the wreckage of a marriage to the 8th Duke of Manchester. That woman was the mother of the man Helena had just married. When Consuelo heard the news, she reportedly did not believe it, until a trusted contact confirmed the marriage in the church register. Her reaction, once confirmed, was described by contemporaries as extreme displeasure. She had every reason for extreme displeasure. She had lived the template. She knew what the title cost the women who bought it. She had been the first woman to buy it, and she had paid for that knowledge with her daughters' lives and her fortune, and the damage of 20 years with a man who had been described before her own wedding as rakish and dissolute. Her son had found a new American to make the same purchase. Eugene Zimmerman's reaction was different in character, but similar in direction. He had been, by the accounts of the press who covered the marriage's aftermath, bitterly opposed to the match. He had heard the Duke's reputation. He had seen the pattern of the 22 supposed engagements. He had seen his own daughter's marriage appear in the newspapers before she had told him it was happening. He was furious, and he was also, as a man who had built his fortune by anticipating risks and managing them, immediately practical about what could still be done. He structured the money. He could not undo the marriage. He could not control the man or the dukedom or the social world into which Helena had married herself. What he could do was ensure that his fortune remained beyond the Duke's reach, that the income would flow to Helena and only to Helena, that the principal would remain in trust administered by people who were not Kim Montagu, that the death of Eugene Zimmerman would not result in a windfall for the man who had married his daughter without his consent and who was already spending money at a rate that suggested the fortune would not survive long if it could be reached directly. He spent the next 14 years making the trust as secure as he could make it. He died in December 1914 with an estate valued at $10 million. A Cincinnati Post article from November 1915 quoted the trust's attorney directly. Not a cent of the Duchess of Manchester's Cincinnati-made money would go to help the Duke out of his $1 million in debts. The attorney said this with some satisfaction. He had no legal claim on the principal. Helena received the income. He could not touch it. He tried anyway. The correspondence between Helena and her father in the years between the wedding and Eugene's death in 1914 has not been fully preserved, but the shape of the relationship is visible in its structure and in the newspaper accounts, and in what the lawyers said publicly after Eugene's death. He monitored the situation. He understood what was happening, the accumulation of debt, the pattern of spending, the mechanisms by which he attempted to access money. The arrangement was designed to keep out of his reach. He responded by tightening the protections where possible and by making sure that every additional gift to Helena was structured as trust income rather than as capital. The Kylemore Castle purchase in 1903 was this strategy in architectural form. Eugene bought the castle. He retained ownership. Helena and Kim occupied it as a residence, but he had no legal claim on the property. When the debts required a sale, the castle went to the nuns rather than to the Duke's creditors. It was the father's asset to sell or gift, not the husband's. The trust he structured at his death was the culmination of 14 years of careful engineering. He died in December 1914 with an estate of $10 million, and he had arranged every detail of that estate's disposition to ensure that the man he had watched spending his daughter's life for 14 years would receive nothing. The income to Helena. The principal protected by trustees, Kim legally excluded. Not a cent of the Duchess of Manchester's Cincinnati-made money will go to the Duke out of his debts, the attorney said in November 1915. $1 million in debts by 1915, on top of whatever had been consumed in the first 15 years of marriage. The attorney said this with satisfaction, and the satisfaction was the satisfaction of a man who had helped build a legal structure that was performing its intended function, keeping money out of the hands of the man for whom it was not intended. Eugene Zimmerman had done everything he could. He had built the protections. He had structured the will. He had bought it in his own name. He had negotiated a prenuptial agreement, not as dramatic as the one his daughter-in-law's mother-in-law had obtained, but present, protecting Helena's legal position as best the law allowed. The law had limits. The decade of the marriage between the wedding and Eugene's death had seen him spend what could be spent and damage what could be damaged, and create complications that would take 17 more years to legally resolve. The father died knowing his daughter was still in the marriage. He died knowing the trust would protect what he could protect. He died not knowing about the 4 women at Kimballton, the Wormwood Scrub sentence, the flight to Cuba. These came later. They came after the protection was in place, which was the protection's limit. Beriswar. Those 30 years are a record of a man trying every available mechanism to circumvent the protections that his father-in-law had erected, and of a woman watching from inside while maintaining, for longer than the record makes comfortable to contemplate, the external forms of a functional aristocratic household. The debts were present from the beginning. Less than a year after the wedding, before the ink on the marriage register had had time to yellow, he was being sued for failing to pay his jeweler's bill. He had bought 3 imitation pearl necklaces as a wedding gift. He had not paid for them, the pearls were fake, and the bill was unpaid, and the jeweler had gone to court. This was November 1901. By 1903, Helena's father had bought the couple Kylemore Castle in Connemara, Ireland, a magnificent 19th-century castle on a lake in the west of Ireland, built originally by a Manchester businessman for his wife and purchased by Eugene Zimmerman as a residence for his daughter in an arrangement that kept the property in the father's control rather than the Duke's. The gesture was both generous and protective. He was giving his daughter a home. He was also ensuring the home could not be pawned. He found other things to pawn. By 1907, he had been involved in a series of financial scandals of escalating severity. By 1908, rumors of the marriage's failure were circulating in the English press. Separation proceedings were initiated in 1915. They failed. Further proceedings in 1921. In 1925, it was publicly announced that an estrangement had existed since 1914, which meant that Helena and her husband had been living separately, if nominally married, for a decade before anyone admitted it officially. In 1918, 66 petitions of bankruptcy had been filed against him in the English courts. 66. The number represents the cumulative complaints of tradespeople and creditors and lenders and hotel managers and tailors and wine merchants and every category of person who had extended credit to a duke and discovered that a dukedom was the only collateral and it was not, legally, transferable as collateral. The jewels were. Technically, the Manchester family jewels were held in trust for the family. They were not the Duke's personal property to dispose of, but he disposed of them anyway. He pawned them. The pawning of entailed jewelry was not legal. He did it. He did it in the manner of a man who had been breaking the rules his entire adult life, and who had never faced consequences serious enough to change the habit. The consequences arrived eventually in the form of Wormwood Scrubb's prison. He served a sentence. He emerged. He continued. The 66 bankruptcy petitions filed against the Duke of Manchester by 1918 require a moment of attention because the number is not a rounding error or a journalistic exaggeration. 66 filed in the English courts. By 1918, 18 years in, each petition represented a creditor, a person or institution that had lent money or extended credit to the 9th Duke of Manchester and had not been repaid and had gone to court. The list covered the full spectrum of the people who had extended such credit: hotels, tailors, wine merchants, moneylenders, bookmakers. Each one had a claim. Each one had waited until waiting was no longer productive, and had then filed the legal paperwork that formalized the wait. The English legal system of the era had specific procedures for the debts of peers of the realm, which were complicated by the fact that a duke's assets and a duke's debts were not always cleanly separable. Entailed properties could not be sold without special legal process. Income from entailed estates was in some cases protected, and the social machinery of the aristocracy was still, in 1918, sufficient to create friction in proceedings against a peer that would not have existed against an ordinary debtor. Kim Montagu navigated this friction with the practiced ease of a man who had been navigating it his entire adult life. He knew which debts were most legally pressing and which could be deferred. He knew which creditors would settle for less than they were owed rather than persist through the court proceedings. He knew how to use the social and legal complexity of his position to buy time, and time, for a man whose plan was always to find the next source of money rather than to stop spending, was the primary resource. Helena's income from the Zimmerman Trust was the next source of money, imperfectly accessed but partially available. The debts he generated were consistently in excess of what the income could service, which produced the accumulation. Each year added new debts on top of the old ones, and the old ones were not being paid off, and the accumulation grew. By 1918, 66 creditors had given up waiting and gone to court. The family jewels were the desperate measure. The Manchester family had what are called heirloom jewels, pieces that had passed through generations of the family and were held, under the terms of the family's succession documents, in trust for the family, rather than as the personal property of the current duke to dispose of. This was a protection built into aristocratic family arrangements precisely because men like the 8th and 9th Dukes of Manchester had always existed, and the families that produced them had learned to anticipate the damage. The 9th Duke pawned them anyway. He pawned heirloom jewelry that the law said he could not pawn. He pawned it to raise cash for debts that the income from the Zimmerman Trust could not cover. He was caught. The pawning of entailed jewelry was not just financially imprudent, but legally criminal. The consequences included Wormwood Scrubs, the Victorian prison in West London that was the destination for men of all classes who had broken the laws it was built to enforce. He served his sentence. He came out. The pattern continued. At Kimbleton Castle, the Cambridgeshire estate, Kim Montagu was found in bed with 4 women. Among them was Tallulah Bankhead. Tallulah Bankhead was, in the early 1920s, the most talked-about actress in London, an Alabama girl who had come to England and made herself the center of the theatrical and social world through a combination of enormous talent, complete indifference to convention, and the kind of sexual charisma that the English aristocracy found simultaneously irresistible and alarming. She was bisexual and brilliant and famous, and she was in the bedroom at Kimbleton with the 9th Duke of Manchester and 3 other women when Helena, or someone acting on Helena's behalf, discovered them. The discovery of 4 women in her husband's bed at the family estate is not the worst thing that happened to Helena Zimmerman in her marriage. It is, however, the detail that the historical record preserves with the greatest precision because it was the kind of detail that contemporaries found simultaneously shocking and unsurprising, and that the press, which had been covering his various embarrassments for decades, reported with a combination of relish and resignation. He had been serially unfaithful since at least the early years of the marriage. The 22 women of the pre-wedding newspapers had been a preview. The jeweler's unpaid bill in 1901 had been a preview of the financial behavior. The 66 bankruptcy petitions by 1918 had been a preview of what happened when the behavior went unchecked for 20 years. Helena bore 4 children. The eldest son, Alexander, would eventually become the 10th Duke of Manchester and would be required to sell the remaining family properties, Kimbleton Castle, which the family had held for centuries, and Tandragee Castle in Northern Ireland, because there was nothing left to maintain them with. The fortune that Helena's father had tried to protect through the trust had been eroded year by year and transaction by transaction, not by direct access to the principal, but by the slow drain of income applied to debts that Kim continuously generated, and that Helena's income was always insufficient to cover. In 1920, because of the Duke's gambling debts, the castle was sold. The castle that Eugene Zimmerman had bought for his daughter, bought specifically so that Helena would have a home that could not be pawned or seized, bought as the one expression of fatherly generosity the arrangement could not produce, was sold to Benedictine nuns who established a monastery on the grounds and who maintain it today as Kylemore Abbey, one of the most visited tourist attractions in Ireland. The nuns are still there. Helena was not. The geography tells the story of its trajectory. They had, across the marriage's span, a townhouse in London, Kimbolton Castle in Cambridgeshire, Tandragee Castle in County Armagh in Northern Ireland, and Kylemore Castle in Connemara in the west of Ireland. 4 properties. The trajectory was from 4 to 0. Kimbolton Castle was the ancestral seat, a 17th century castle in Cambridgeshire that had been the family's ancestral home for centuries. Remodeled by Vanbrugh and Hawksmoor in the early 18th century, the physical expression of what the dukedom meant in its full historical context. It was enormous and expensive to maintain, and the income required to maintain it had been declining since the 8th Duke's gambling had begun eating through the family resources a generation earlier. Kimbolton was where Helena lived as Duchess of Manchester. It was where she raised her 4 children. It was where he held his house parties with their various guests and their various outcomes. It was where, at some point in the 1920s, Kim Montagu was found in bed with 4 women, including Tallulah Bankhead. The scene at Kimbolton with the 4 women has been repeated in every account of those years. Tallulah Bankhead was, by the early 1920s, the most talked about theatrical figure in London. An American girl from Alabama who had arrived in England and made herself the center of the theatrical avant-garde through sheer force of talent and personality. She was not discreet. The combination of Tallulah Bankhead and the Duke of Manchester in a castle in Cambridgeshire, and the details of the discovery produced a story that the press found irresistible and that Helena was required to manage in the way of a woman who has been managing impossible situations for years and who has developed, through practice, the capacity to absorb new information about her husband's behavior without visibly collapsing. Tandragee Castle in County Armagh was the same castle to which Kim's mother, Consuelo Yznaga, had been exiled by the 8th Duke, sent to Ireland as punishment for being the wife of a man who had spent her money. Helena lived there too, in the periodic absences from London and Kimbolton that the arrangement required. The same castle, the same patterns, the same Northern Ireland rain. The Connemara Castle was Eugene Zimmerman's gift, purchased in 1903, the father's attempt to give his daughter something beautiful and hers in a marriage that was proving to be neither. The castle in Connemara, on a lake surrounded by the mountains of the west of Ireland, was extraordinary in the way of large Victorian houses placed in wild landscapes, a gesture of romance translated into stone and water, and the grandeur of a man who had made his fortune in Ohio oil and who was now spending it on a castle in Ireland for a daughter he had not managed to protect. He spent the money anyway. Not the castle directly. It was in Eugene's name. But the gambling debts accumulated around it like water rising around a fortified position, and in 1920 the position fell. The Benedictine nuns of Ypres, displaced from their Belgian monastery by the First World War, purchased it and established Kylemore Abbey, which has operated continuously ever since. It is now one of the most visited properties in Ireland, a working school and monastery and tourist attraction, the mountains and the lake exactly as they were when Eugene Zimmerman bought it for his daughter in 1903. The nuns have been there a century. Helena and Kim had 4 children. The eldest son, Alexander George Francis Drogo Montagu, was born in 1902 and became the 10th Duke of Manchester after his father's death in 1947. He inherited a title without the resources to sustain it, and was forced to sell both Kimbolton and Tandragee, the 2 remaining Manchester properties, because there was nothing left to maintain them. Kimbolton was sold to Kimbolton School, which operates there today. Tandragee Castle was sold and eventually became the headquarters of Tato, the Irish crisp manufacturer, which purchased it for its distinctive architecture and its storage capacity. The ancestral home of that ancestral home is now a crisp factory. Alexander had 2 sons of his own who continued the Manchester title, Sidney, the 11th Duke, and Angus, the 12th. The 12th Duke of Manchester, Angus Montagu, had a career that continued the family tradition of financial difficulty and legal complication into the 21st century, ultimately dying in Australia in 2002 in circumstances that the press covered with the mixture of sadness and dark amusement that had attended the Manchester title for over a century. The second son, Lord Edward Eugene Fernando Montagu, was born in 1906. Two daughters followed, Lady Mary Alice Montagu and Lady Ellen Millicent Louise Montagu. These four children grew up in the household that Kim and Helena made, the household of a marriage that was publicly failing from at least 1908, in which the father was present irregularly and the mother was managing the practical work of the household and the children and the finances and the reputation that the name required. Helena raised four children in the conditions produced by 30 years of the 9th Duke of Manchester. The children were, by the accounts available, fond of their mother. The eldest son, Alexander's sale of the family properties, was the act of a man clearing up the consequences of his father's behavior, not adding to them. The family line continued. The Manchester title continued through the sons and the grandsons to the present generation. The title that was sold to save a crumbling castle crumbled the castle anyway. The children who grew up in it managed as best they could. The divorce came in December 1931. It came late because he delayed it, for reasons that mixed legal strategy with the contempt of a man who understood that the formal marriage, whatever its practical reality, continued to provide him with social cover and residual financial access that a divorce would end. He had been absent from the marriage in the practical sense since at least 1914. He continued to be technically Kim Montagu, married to the Duchess of Manchester for 17 years after the estrangement was publicly known. He obtained the divorce by absconding to Cuba in November 1931 and applying for a divorce there under Cuban law, which was less restrictive than English law on the grounds available. This was the last of the many things he did without asking permission from anyone. The secret marriage in 1900, the fake pearls, the pawned jewels, the 4 women at Kimballton, the 66 bankruptcies, the Wormwood Scrub sentence, the flight to Cuba. He remarried the same year to Kathleen Dawes of Connecticut, another American woman because the type had served him before, and the pattern was the only pattern he knew. He died in Seaford, Sussex, in February 1947 at 70, leaving no significant estate, having spent several American fortunes and his own family's resources in the course of a life organized around the single principle that money was a thing other people had, and that charm and title were the tools by which it could be transferred. The Manchester title passed to his son Alexander, who sold Kimballton and Tandragee because there was nothing left to maintain them with. The crumbling castle had been crumbling since before Helena arrived. It finished crumbling after she left. The years between the divorce in December 1931 and the second marriage in November 1937 are 6 years, about which the historical record says relatively little. Helena was 53 when the divorce came. She was free for the first time in 31 years from the formal obligations of a marriage that had been practically over since 1914 and technically contested since 1921. She was also in the position of a woman who has been through something that reshapes identity, who is no longer the Duchess of Manchester in the practical sense, who is no longer the managed crisis and maintained appearances Duchess of Manchester, and who is discovering what she is when the crisis is no longer present to be managed. She was 53 years old. She had 4 grown children. She had the income from the Zimmerman Trust, which he had not been able to touch directly and which had been supporting her through the separation years, and which continued to provide the financial independence that allowed the divorce to be a liberation rather than a catastrophe. She had the social world she had built over 30 years in England, the friendships and the connections and the knowledge of how the world she had lived in worked that could not be taken from her by a divorce. She had also a clear knowledge of what she did not want. She did not want another man whose primary interest was in her money. She had 30 years of evidence about what that looked like in practice, and the evidence was comprehensive and consistent. She did not want the aristocratic world of house parties and hunts and the performance of ducal life that had required her to be the Duchess of Manchester, while the Duke was doing what the Duke did. She did not want the social machinery of the London season and the country house and the castle in Connemara. She wanted something smaller, something real, something that Dinard had never promised, and that 30 years of the Manchester marriage had shown her could not be purchased with a father's fortune or protected by a trust. Arthur Keith-Falconer, the 10th Earl of Kintore, had a castle in Aberdeenshire. He had fought in 2 wars. He was 51 when she married him at 59. His older sister would eventually inherit the Kintore title, which meant that what Helena was marrying was not primarily a title, but a man. The earldom came with it. She became the Countess of Kintore on November 23, 1937. But the title was incidental in the way that the first marriage's title had been central. The costume ball had been about the title, so had Marylebone Church, and everything the 8th and 9th Dukes represented. Keith Hall was about something else. Keith Hall in Aberdeenshire was about a man who had fought in the Boer War, and came home and served in the First World War, and came home again, and who, at 51, was looking for a partner rather than an heiress. She was the partner he was looking for. They had 29 years. She outlived him by 5. She died at Keith Hall on December 15, 1971, the Dowager Countess of Kintore, at 93 years old. The 9th Duke of Manchester had been dead for 24 years. The Kylemore nuns were still in Connemara. Kimbleton was a school. Tandragee was a crisp factory. The Manchester tiara was in the Victoria and Albert Museum, behind glass in the Jewelry Gallery. Helena Zimmerman had lived long enough to see all of it. The connection between Helena Zimmerman and Consuelo Yznaga is the thread that the dukedom's history pulls taut across 2 generations. Consuelo Yznaga had married the 8th Duke of Manchester in 1876. She had paid for the title with $1 million dowry. She had watched the dowry disappear into gambling debts. She had been sent to live in Tandragee Castle as punishment for her husband's behavior. She had lost her twin daughters to tuberculosis. She had built a career as an Anglo-American social intermediary to survive the financial depletion of the marriage. She had died in 1909, having outlived her husband and her daughters and the fortune she had brought. 24 years after Consuelo married the 8th Duke, Helena married his son. The 9th Duke was 23 years old when he married Helena. He had grown up watching his mother manage the wreckage of his father's spending. He had grown up in the Tandragee exile and the return and the career his mother had built from what remained. He had observed at close range and for his entire childhood and young adulthood exactly what the Manchester title did to the women who bought it. He replicated the pattern anyway. This is the detail that the history of the Manchester dukedom makes unavoidable. The pattern was not accidental, not the result of individual bad character operating without context. It was institutional. The Manchester title had been, for at least 2 generations, a mechanism for extracting American fortunes from American women by offering social position in exchange. The 8th Duke had used Consuelo Yznaga this way. The 9th Duke used Helena Zimmerman the same way. The title was the product. The American heiress was the revenue source. The transaction was dressed as marriage and sustained by the social architecture of the Gilded Age. Consuelo Yznaga's son married Helena Zimmerman. The mother had been the cautionary tale. The son was the instrument. The Manchester tiara, the Cartier tiara that Consuelo Yznaga had commissioned in the years of her widowhood, paid for with money she had earned rather than inherited, left to the Victoria and Albert Museum at her death, was still in the museum when Helena married Kim. It is still there today, behind glass in the Jewelry Gallery. Helena was photographed in court dress in 1912 wearing the Manchester tiara, the tiara her mother-in-law had left to the nation. The woman who bought it and the woman who wore it are both in the record. The man who went through both their fortunes is also in the record. The record is clear about who paid and who spent. What Helena Zimmerman brought, beyond the money, was herself. And the record of what happened to herself across 30 years is the record that the financial accounts tend to obscure. She was an accomplished woman, skilled at horse riding and fencing, well educated in France, socially capable in the demanding world of the English aristocracy, which had specific standards for the Duchess of Manchester, that Helena was required to meet regardless of what was happening inside the household. She entertained. She maintained the properties. She appeared at court. the 1912 photograph in court dress, wearing the Manchester tiara, wearing the fake pearls her husband had never paid for, is the evidence of a woman performing the role it had assigned to her, with all the external competence that the role required. She appeared in the press at charitable events. She managed the staff. She ran Kimbolton and Tandragee and Kylemore, with the practicality of a woman who has understood early on that if the household was to function, she will be the one making it function. She bore the children. She raised the children. She sat through the bankruptcy proceedings and the separation rumors and the public scandals and the discovery of whatever was discovered at Kimbolton and the pawn jewels and the Wormwood scrub sentence and the 66 bankruptcies and the sale of Kylemore and the formal estrangement and the 17 years of nominal marriage after the practical marriage had ended. She did all of this. She was also, by 1931, 53 years old and free. The freedom that came at 53 is the part of the story that the title, "The Bride Sold to Save a Crumbling Castle," makes invisible. The bride existed for 4 months in the summer and autumn of 1900. The woman who survived the marriage and remarried and lived 40 more years at Keith Hall in Scotland was a different person. Not the woman who had danced in Brittany, not the woman who had received the fake pearls, not the person who had managed Kimbolton and managed the children and managed his disasters. Something harder, something that the 30 years had produced in the way that survival produces things that ease does not. Arthur Keith-Falconer, the 10th Earl of Kintore, was a Scottish soldier who had fought in the Boer War and survived the First World War, and who had by 1937, when Helena married him, enough experience of difficulty to understand the value of what he was getting in a woman who had also survived. The marriage at Keith Hall was not a rescue. It was a meeting between two people who had both been tested and who chose each other on the basis of what they actually were, rather than what a costume ball had suggested they might be. She was 59. He was 51. They had 29 years. The Downton Abbey connection is not incidental. Julian Fellows has acknowledged that the story of the American heiress marrying the cash-strapped English earl, the central premise of Downton Abbey, which ran for 6 series and won numerous awards and became one of the most watched British television programs of its era, was drawn from the history of the Gilded Age transatlantic marriages. The specific details of the Cora Levinson who becomes Lady Grantham, who brings an American railroad fortune to a great English house and saves it from financial ruin, track the broad outlines of the cash for coronets phenomenon that produced Helena Zimmerman and Consuelo Yznaga and Consuelo Vanderbilt, and hundreds of other American women. Helena's story is more specific than the Downton Abbey template because it is true, and because the true version is harder than the television version. In Downton Abbey, the Earl of Grantham is a man of genuine quality, whose financial difficulties are a circumstance rather than a character. In Helena's version, the 9th Duke of Manchester was a man whose character was the circumstance. A man whose gambling and infidelity and financial recklessness were not misfortunes that happened to him, but choices he made, repeatedly, across 30 years of marriage, in the face of every legal and social constraint his father-in-law could construct. The television show gives the marriage a happy outcome. The real version gives it wormwood scrubs and 66 bankruptcies, and 4 women at Kimbolton, and a flight to Cuba, and a sale of Kylemore to nuns. The real version gives it eventually a second marriage in Scotland, and 29 years at Keith Hall, and a death at 93. The happy outcome was delayed. It arrived. It was not the outcome Dinard had promised. The Buccaneers. Edith Wharton's unfinished novel about the American heiresses who crossed the Atlantic in the 1870s and 1880s, and its television adaptations, present the transatlantic marriage as primarily a story about women finding themselves. Helena Zimmerman's story is also about a woman finding herself, but the finding took longer and cost more and required first the unmaking of the costume ball fantasy, and then the slow reconstruction of something genuine from the materials that remained after 30 years of the marriage. She was 21 when she married Kim. She was 53 when the divorce finally came. She was 59 when she made the second choice. She had 32 years of bad marriage and then 40 years of life. 40 years in which the crumbling castle receded into the past, and Scotland came into focus, and the woman who had fallen in love at a costume ball in Duinard became, in the way survival becomes its own kind of achievement, something much harder to take from her. 93 years old, Kylemore Abbey, the nuns still there. The 9th Duke of Manchester, 24 years dead, the Manchester tiara in the Victoria and Albert Museum, behind glass. Her mother-in-law's tiara, the object that the woman before her had bought and left to the nation. Helena wore it in 1912 in a court dress with pearls. The pearls may have been the fake ones her husband had given her and never paid for. They may have been real ones she had bought herself. The photograph does not say. The woman wearing the tiara knows the difference. She always knew. She was a Cincinnati girl who fell in love at a costume ball and paid for it across 30 years and built something worth having from what was left. That is the story. That is what the Gilded Age cost the women who lived it from the inside. That is Helena Zimmerman. The Manchester tiara is in the Jewelry Gallery at the Victoria and Albert Museum. It was made by Cartier in 1903, paid for by Consuelo Yznaga, the Duke's mother, with money she had earned in the years of her widowhood, the money she had made from being useful to American families navigating the Anglo-American social world. She left it to the museum at her death in 1909. Helena wore it in court dress in 1912, 9 years after it had been given to the nation by her mother-in-law. There is a photograph. She is in white court dress. The tiara sits on her head. She is wearing pearls. Real or fake, the photograph does not say. And the question of whether Helena's pearls were real or fake is a question about the whole marriage condensed into an accessory. The tiara she wore had been bought by a woman who paid for the Manchester title with her fortune in 1876. The tiara was on Helena's head in 1912 because Helena had paid for it with her fortune in 1900. Two American women from different generations, different countries, different families, the same transaction. Consuelo Yznaga left the tiara to the museum because she understood that objects outlast people and that a tiara left to an institution is better than a tiara pawned by a duke. The 9th Duke pawned the family jewels anyway. The Manchester tiara was not among them. It was already in the museum's collection, beyond his reach. This may be why it survives. Two women paid for the Manchester title. One left a tiara in a museum. One left a photograph of herself wearing it. The museum still has the tiara. The Duke is in the record. The record is clear about who paid and who spent, and who, in the end, left something that lasted. That is the story of Helena Zimmerman. That is what the Gilded Age cost the women who paid for it. That is the bride who was sold to save a crumbling castle. The castle crumbled anyway. She survived it, 93 years old. Keith Hall in Scotland. That was enough. That was more than the costume ball had promised. That was hers.